Hello guys, and welcome to another video. Now, I've started a fresh SSF playthrough in Path of Exile 2 because I wanted to kind of get an idea of all of the changes that GGG have been making to the game over the past sort of month or so. There's been a lot of really important changes that have come in slowly over time, and I thought it would be a nice opportunity to actually do a fresh start in SSF so I can get an idea of how all of those changes kind of stack up together and how they make the game feel. Because I think a lot of changes have kind of fixed different things, different problems, especially in the campaign that were happening with that 0.2 launch. And now to get an idea of how things feel, all together, that was the idea of this new playthrough. So I'm playing a new character, a new Ascendancy that I've never played, the Acolyte of Chayula. I'm playing a completely different build, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but this video is going to be split into two parts. The first is going to be my impressions of all of the changes that GGG have been making to Path of Exile 2, all compiled together specifically for the campaign. And then the second half of the video is going to be discussing the build that I'm playing briefly and kind of a bit of an overview of what's going on with that. Let's discuss the campaign and all of the changes that they've been making to the game. Now, these changes can be kind of summarized into a few categories. We had the changes to monster life and monster speed. We had the changes to specific loot drops in the campaign. That is in regards to things like Artificer's Orbs being forced as special drops from, side quests or bits of content that you find in the world. And then the other change there is the really big one, which came very recently. That was the loot patch, which actually took about 2 weeks, I think, in the end after they first announced it. But it finally came around, and that has made a really big impact on the game, it seems. So, my impressions of, first of all, the monster life changes and monster speed. Now, in terms of monster life, I think the game definitely feels a little bit more like it did in 0.1, and that's a good thing, because in 0.1, the campaign actually felt very, very good. I thought overall it was the best part of the game, and when you kind of compared it to the end game, the two parts of the game felt completely different. And the campaign just felt very good in the place where it was at that time. And in 0.2, the campaign felt terrible to begin with. I think a lot of the changes to balance that they made really shook the campaign up in a bad way. And a lot of the changes that they've made since then have slowly been getting the campaign back to where it was and getting it into that more kind of stable progression that feels good to actually play through the game. Now, one of those things was the monster life changes, and that came quite early into the patch. One of the other things that came a little bit later on was the changes to monster speed, and one of the things that I think with speed and monster life is there as well a little bit, but with monster speed, it's kind of based on the player's progression and how far they are through their character progression, how their gear progression is looking and things like that. This is also the case for monster life, but it's to a lesser extent. The example that I'm trying to make there is that if you have 10% movement speed boost and you don't find anything better and you're going into Act 3, well, you are going to get completely swarmed by those monsters on the Dreadnought map, because they're already extremely fast compared to most of the other monsters in that act. And, if you have really bad movement speed and you're just kind of very slow and sluggish, those monsters are going to swarm you even after the nerfs to monster speed. Now, one of the things they did do in this patch is that they actually help to fix the monster speed problems by fixing some existing bugs that they actually didn't know about beforehand, and they only found out about these after they actually went in and checked out what was going on. And one of the things that people were really complaining about there was the Dreadnought map particularly, and some of the other maps there with the Faradin. Well, the Faradin monsters were really, really problematic, and one of the reasons that they were so problematic, and this came from Jonathan, was that whenever they were being interrupted, one of their actions were actually being interrupted kind of mid-animation, they would immediately go into the next animation and, hit you very quickly. So there was never a window of time there where you could possibly actually get an attack off yourself. You were always constantly being swarmed. So that was something that they actually went in and fixed, and I have to say that area in the campaign definitely feels better now. It still feels like a challenge, and I think that that's what they were going for with the Dreadnought. It was supposed to feel really, really overwhelming, like actually getting to the throne of that area, right? That's the kind of build up and the climax to Act 2. So that area is particularly powerful and it's very, very scary, but I think that one fix that they've made is a good thing, and it does feel a little bit more in line with the rest of the progression of Act 2 now. Still feels scary, still feels like the pinnacle of Act 2, which is what they were going for, but those changes overall were pretty good, I think. Now, one of the other changes that they made specifically to the campaign is adding forced Artificer Orb drops in specific locations, either from quests or from finding content out in the world, like particular vistas and things like that. So Artificer's Orbs were a big problem for me, especially I actually voiced this in a previous video about how I wanted to make use of Artificer's Orbs and use my runes and things like that on my gear as I progress, but I always kind of had this in the back of my mind where I was actually waiting for a very good item to drop so that I could then use an Artificer's Orb and place a rune in there, because I didn't want to waste an Artificer's Orb on a lesser item that I would be replacing very soon, or would have the idea to replace it very soon, because it's just, you know, not very good. I want to find something that's going to last me the next 2 or 3 acts, and that way I feel like I've made a good investment actually using the Artificer's Orb. Well, now it just feels like I can always use an Artificer's Orb if I want to. If I find a semi-decent item, even if it's something that's only a slight upgrade to the current item that I'm wearing, I can just equip that, throw an Artificer's Orb on it, and use a rune in there as well, and that is really, really nice. Now, on a side note, I do want to take a brief moment to talk about runes, because runes have always been a little bit of a problem, in my opinion, in Path of Exile 2, and there is still a little bit of a problem with them. I think the issue there is that they actually have a little bit more of an RNG component than I think they should have right now, especially in the campaign. I can actually give my own example there of the most recent playthrough that I've just done. I was playing an Acolyte of Chayula build, a poison build, and with that kind of setup that I was going for there, I wanted iron runes to upgrade my weapon, to upgrade my physical damage there on the weapon. And I found a total of 1 iron rune all the way up to Act 6, and right at the end of Act 6, I found my second iron rune. I used that first iron rune on a weapon at the beginning of Act 2, and I didn't have any from that point onwards, you know, all the way till the end of Act 6, or, you know, Cruel Act 3. And so I think the RNG component there of runes could be tweaked up a little bit. I think there's actually a couple of ways that you can do that. The first thing that I would like to see is when you salvage an item that has runes in it, I think it should have a chance to salvage the runes. So this chance could be something like 25%, as long as there's a chance there. You gain the Artificer shards, and you gain any, like, you know, blacksmith stones or anything like that if there's quality on it. But you also have a chance to actually salvage the runes from the item. That would be a really nice addition, I think. It means that you kind of feel like you can salvage weapons and things like that for the purpose of trying to get those runes back to then use them again. I think that would be a really nice change. And the other thing that I think they could do is they could add a couple of rune slots that can appear on vendors. They don't need to be offering every rune all the time, just a couple of random runes that rotate whenever the vendor refreshes. That just means that you can always check the vendors for runes, and, you know, that way if you are getting really unlucky on runes, you can always have a look at the vendor. Hopefully they have what you need, and then you can just, you know, buy that and continue on. So that is one thing, a bit of a side tangent there on runes, that I think, whilst the Artificer Orb situation is feeling quite good, it does feel a bit annoying to just never get the rune that you're looking for, because you just don't get the right RNG and you just don't get it. Now, moving on to the loot changes, that is the kind of more broad patch that came in very recently, and they fixed a lot of things in terms of loot, and I was a bit concerned about this patch before it happened. I was thinking, are they going to go overboard with loot? Is it going to feel ridiculous coming out of this patch? Now, I can't talk about endgame specifically just yet. I'm going to be doing that in a future video after I've played the endgame a bit more. I've only just got to endgame, only played some 5 or so maps, something like that. And so this is going to be specifically how normal loot feels in the campaign. Now, overall, I would say that this is quite a big improvement. It's not like a huge loot explosion that's happening from every rare mob in the campaign, but you do feel like you are getting more currency that you need in the campaign. I feel like I was getting more exalts and more regals specifically, and those are the things that you really, really want in the campaign. That's kind of how you find your gear upgrades, is by being able to actually, you know, slam items and get extra modifiers. And getting those 2 currencies in particular, getting more of those 2 currencies felt really, really good. So overall, I would say that the loot patch has been a success on the campaign, and I have heard things for the, you know, endgame mapping experience that people are dropping a bit too much, perhaps in some places. I think that's always something that they can go back in and review later on. Like, they can review what exactly is going on when there's, like, giant loot explosions. Is it that there's, you know, too much quantity and overlapping rarity mechanics and things like that? But that is something they can deal with if it is a problem. But overall, for me, for my own personal experience as a fresh SSF playthrough, I think that the loot changes felt pretty good. Now, let's move on to the build that I'm playing, because I thought I'd take the opportunity to play something completely different that I haven't played just yet. So I'm actually playing an Acolyte of Chayula, of all things, right? This is probably on most people's radar as the worst ascendancy in the game. And I'm playing this ascendancy for a very specific reason, which we'll get to in just a moment. So this build is a gas grenade build, and the gas grenade part of the skill that I'm focusing on is actually the poison cloud, not the explosion. Usually when you see people playing gas grenade, it's because they're playing this explosion portion, and if you actually look at the skill here, you can see that the explosion portion deals a pretty large amount of attack damage, but the poison cloud deals the same amount of damage. However, it doesn't deal it as a hit. It deals this damage here as if it did hit the enemy, but it actually inflicts a poison based on this attack hit here. So we don't interact with the explosion part of the skill at all, and we're just focusing on this poison cloud. So how this skill works is you throw out a gas grenade, it spends, 2 seconds on the ground or so, and then it explodes. When it explodes, it deals this attack damage right here, 141%. This is a level 16 or level 18 gem, and then it actually creates a poison cloud which grows every second, and each second it gets bigger and bigger. So the poison cloud gets bigger. It continuously applies poison to monsters inside that cloud. Now, the most important thing about this skill is this line right here. Does not hit, but poisons enemies as though hitting them. So this is a guaranteed poison. If monsters are in this cloud, they will be poisoned by the poison cloud. And that is actually quite important, because one thing is that you don't need this attack to actually hit monsters. If they're in the cloud, they will be poisoned. That means that accuracy doesn't matter, for example. They will just continuously be poisoned by this cloud. And the other thing there is that it says, even though it does not hit, it poisons as though hitting. So that's where the second part of this build comes in, and that's the Acolyte of Chayula. So the Acolyte of Chayula has this node right here, Reality Rending. So this provides you with several different chances to obtain a huge amount of extra chaos damage. So this rolls every time you would, hit a monster. It rolls this chance to gain extra chaos damage. And how poison works in Path of Exile 2 is that it's based on physical or chaos hit damage. So if you deal a hit of physical or chaos damage or both, it will then inflict a poison. If you roll chance poison, it will inflict a poison. And that poison will be based on a percentage of the hit damage of physical or chaos, or both of them combined. So Reality Rending provides 23% chance to gain 25% of damage as extra chaos, and then 13% for 50% as extra chaos, and 7% for 100% as extra chaos. Now, this actually applies to the Poison Cloud. So the Poison Cloud, when it actually poisons as though hitting, it will also include damage as extra modifiers. That actually gets rolled into this, and that means that this is a really, really good way to scale the poison from the Poison Cloud. And one of the reasons why this is actually so good is because of the duration of how long Gas Grenade lasts. Gas Grenade is a ground ability that creates a large kind of area of denial there, which is constantly applying poison. And this duration, you can see right here, the cloud duration is 6 seconds baseline. This is actually affected by skill effect duration as well. I've got a little bit on the passive tree. Gas cloud duration, 8.5 seconds. So that's the duration of my gas cloud right now. Whenever I apply a gas grenade on the ground, it will last for 8.5 seconds. But that is not the duration of the poison. That's the duration of the gas cloud, which is constantly applying poison, right? So the actual poison itself, you can go down here, is 3.1 seconds. So if a target stands in the gas cloud, they're going to be immediately poisoned, and the gas cloud is going to persist for 8.5 seconds. And then after the gas cloud finishes, the target is then going to remain being poisoned for a further 3.1 seconds. And this gas cloud is constantly applying poisons to monsters inside it as it pulses and gets kind of bigger, right? And as I said, that kind of takes on the extra damage there from Reality Rending. That's a really, really good way to actually scale that up. So that is the main premise of this build, is that you're able to continuously drop poison clouds on the same location, and every time you do that, and every time those poisons actually pulse, you are rolling for that extra damage there. So you're actually rolling to gain a bunch of extra damage, which will improve the poison, because this is extra chaos damage, right? So you're always rolling all of your damage, and then that percentage is being applied as extra chaos if you actually succeed on that roll. Now, one of the really interesting things about this, which I will speak about in a little bit more detail in a moment, is that you can actually make use of non-physical, non-chaos damage types to improve your poison damage, and that's because the extra damage is actually taken from that pool of damage. We'll get to that a little bit more in just a moment when I discuss why I picked this build for SSF in this particular playthrough. But first, let's talk about the other node on the Acolyte of Chayula, that is Waking Dream. So, Waking Dream grants you this Into the Breach skill. Now, Into the Breach is an interesting one. This is a persistent buff skill, doesn't reserve any spirit. And there's actually quite a few nodes like this on different ascendancies. For example, you have the first node on the Blood Mage, right, which is a persistent buff skill, doesn't reserve any spirit, and it provides this kind of buff where you can pick up the Blood Orbs. That is very similar to this. What this does is it makes these little things spawn around you and you can pick them up. You can run around and pick them up. As you can see, when you actually pick up these things, they apply different buffs. The red ones, when you pick them up, will leech 7% of your life. The blue ones will leech 7% of your mana. And the purple ones will grant 7% of damage as extra chaos damage for 5 seconds. Now, here's the interesting thing about Into the Breach, and in 0.1, I was pretty convinced that this was a bug, but after this wasn't fixed in 0.2, I'm actually convinced at this point that this is not a bug, and this is by design. And that's that Into the Breach has a bunch of support gems, and because this is a persistent buff, you can place support gems in here which are, reservation-based support persistent buff gems. So things like Vitality, for example, which grant you life regeneration, well, that reserves 20 spirit, right? But here's the thing about this. All of these support gems in here that reserve spirit do not reserve any spirit. All of them are free to reserve, which means that these sockets are extremely valuable to provide, those really strong persistent buffs. And that is one of the strongest things about Into the Breach. Like, the actual skill itself is quite nice, being able to run around. It's quite nice to be able to solve, your life recovery and your mana recovery whilst you're mapping. That is pretty cool. But this part here, that you're able to actually reserve things for free, is really, really strong. Now, as I mentioned, I did believe that this was a bug, but I think what's actually going on here is that the reason why this is set up so that, Into the Breach doesn't reserve any spirit on those support gems is because this ascendancy has access to an entire branch, which is, 3 notables, and that branch is the Darkness mechanic. And the Darkness mechanic, once you actually take this first node here, you have no spirit. Now, what that would mean is that if you actually took this branch and then also took Waking Dream, you would essentially have this ability here that can have no support gems, because the only support gems that can actually go in there are ones that would, potentially increase up the spirit, and any of those would no longer be able to actually be used because, you have this Darkness branch and your spirit has been removed. So I think what's actually going on there is that this is by design, that Waking Dream actually doesn't reserve any spirit on those support gems. However, I would expect that they would actually do this a little bit differently. I would expect to make it so that if you actually do take this, then it becomes free. And if you actually don't take this, it still costs spirit. But as of right now, Waking Dream support gems in there do not cost any spirit. Garatha was actually doing a build last league with Gas Arrow. So not Gas Grenade, but Gas Arrow, which is obviously a little bit better to be able to actually reach on the tree, sort of arrow, anything to do with arrows in this section rather than having to go all the way down here. But Gas Arrow is significantly weaker in terms of the amount of damage that it deals compared to Gas Grenade. And so I wanted to actually try out Gas Grenade in this patch to see how it feels. And so far, this build has felt pretty good. I would say right now, the biggest problem I'm having is defenses, and that's going to be solved over time with getting better gear, and obviously speccing into all of this energy shield stuff. Once I actually have better gear, that's going to feel quite nice. And one of the last things I wanted to actually discuss with this build at the end here is why I chose this and why I think it's actually really good for solo self-found. So there's actually a couple of reasons for that. I already mentioned earlier that the Poison Cloud poisons as though hitting, and you actually don't care about accuracy. So that's one upside. You don't need accuracy to poison at all. You just always can apply a poison no matter what. Even if you have terrible accuracy, doesn't matter. You can always apply poison. So that's one upside. The second upside is that in a poison attack-based build, your weapon is really, really important. But the thing is about a weapon when it comes to poison is that you want it to be pure physical or physical and chaos. This weapon, you'll notice, has some lightning damage on it. Now, that's not by design. I actually, as I mentioned earlier, I don't have any iron runes right now, otherwise this would have 2 iron runes in there. However, I can make use of damage that is non-physical and non-chaos, and that's because whenever the Reality Rending, or indeed Waking Dream, rolls its extra damage, it actually takes that extra damage from the entire pool of damage. Because, for example, when Gas Grenade actually attempts to poison, it will deal a full hit of damage. You can actually see that right here on the Poison Cloud. This is the attack damage that it's utilizing for the poison. So how this is going to work is that this attack damage here is the number that's used to scale the portion that is poisoning as though hitting, right? It will take all of the damage that you deal, even non-physical and chaos damage, and apply that hit, and then of that hit, it will then take only the portion that can poison and apply the poison. Now what that means is that whenever the damage is rolled as extra from Reality Rending or from Waking Dream, it will also account for any non-physical, non-chaos damage, right? So anything like elemental, any added lightning, added fire, added cold that you have, you will gain extra chaos damage based on that damage as well. And that means that for this portion of lightning here, even though it's useless if I don't roll the extra damage in terms of poison, if I do roll the extra chaos damage, I will gain chaos damage based on that lightning damage. And that means that you can always make use of any damage that you have on your weapon. So even if you have a really bad weapon for poison, you can still make use of it if and when you actually roll that extra damage, right? Which is actually really nice, because Reality Rending does provide quite a bit of extra damage there, quite commonly. You know, 23% chance to gain 25% of damage as extra chaos. That is going to happen quite often. So, you know, even if you have a bad weapon, you can actually make do with it in this kind of build because of the way that works. So that's another nice idea there for SSF. And I think the last thing really is the location on the tree. You know, right now, defenses in Path of Exile 2 are in complete shambles, in my opinion. I think it's one of the weakest part of the game right now. Something that GGG really needs to focus on is, you know, how players can actually invest into defenses. And we still have this meta right now where evasion and energy shield are the strongest defenses, which means that I kind of have to play that. And where this ascendancy starts, where the monk actually starts on the tree, you have access to all of those really strong energy shield and evasion nodes right off the bat. So that's another nice thing there for SSF. And that's pretty much it. That's what I wanted to cover in this video. Kind of a bit of a casual video there where I just run through my thoughts of the game right now, the campaign, and also the new build that I'm playing. Nothing too in depth. I will do a follow-up video, and thanks so much for watching this video. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.